Do you feel comfortable being awkward? What would you do if Max Roach called upon you to solo? These stories and more on the next Music Un-Tuxed, featuring legendary jazz saxophonist Francis Wong. Welcome, everybody, to Music Untuxed. And this week's guest is the legendary jazz saxophonist, community builder, right from Chinatown, San Francisco, Francis Wong, and a professor in his own right on many levels. Great to
Hey,
have you.
well, thank you for having me.
Well, I've learned so much from you over the years. I think you've pretty much changed my life. The community work that you've done and the type of musicianship that you have has just opened me up as a person. And so this is a dream come true having you on my podcast that spells out community building and musical excellence. You clearly embody that.
I feel likewise about you. You've changed my practice quite a bit. So I feel transformed
Oh,
in working with you. Yeah.
thanks. I'd love to go back. So prior to us meeting, because you have a whole lifetime. I mean, we've only known each other for 10 years.
Yeah.
It feels like a long time. And it also feels like yesterday. And I know I've read your memoirs and I've heard your music and we've performed together on many different levels. But what really inspired you to pretty much become the artist that you are?
I do feel like I came out of the 60s and 70s political upheaval in this country.
Mhm.
And in some ways, that's how I found my purpose in trying to pursue music, because I probably wouldn't have pursued music as a profession just on my own devices. But I think that I just got exposed to another way of living, because the activism of the 60s and 70s really inspired me to think about, oh, I could devote my life to something. Because in particular, the Black Arts Movement promoted that music was part of liberation. That allowed me to integrate two very important aspects of my personality. For me, I just got exposed to jazz, the blues, and the idea that there's music of people who are resisting oppression, that are trying to uplift their sense of humanity, and who are in movement to change their situation. In particular, the music of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement kind of attracted me to that. I think later on, I was able to engage with the music of my parents' generation in terms of the efforts to free China from colonialism, and how that was actually also part of the American musical folklore. When I was growing up, for about the first 10 years or so, there weren't that many Asian Americans. There weren't that many Chinese Americans. And since that time, speaking to Chinese Americans, we've become a lot more of a factor, a larger population, more established in multiple walks of life.
What what do you think that does for the Asian population in America? A larger influx, and what do you
Well,
think?
on balance, I think it's made the country richer and more democratic,
Yes.
because why did people come here? Folks come here because there is a promise to, well, get away from some of the fairly fundamental and traumatic conditions
Hmm.
that people face, mainly due to, well, US, but not only US colonialism. So if people come here because they have a sense that there's some possibility for a better life.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, it's a very optimistic worldview. I think immigrants have contributed that optimism and desire for a better future.
How has the music and the arts changed in a activist role over the past 50 years? And I would actually love to hear about some of your influences, some of the great musicians that you have worked with that were activists, your mentors.
Mm,
And then also today,
mm,
what you're seeing as activism today from like the millennials.
mhm, 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 mhm. Starting with the last question first, we have a time where, in terms of the demographic shift, there's so much music coming from these different experiences, being human and making humanity. And so you have folks who are coming from different parts of the world, who have different, who are engaged in, like I said, the optimistic idea of a better life. And so the music reflects that.
Mm.
And so you have, for example, as an Asian American, you have more and more the possibility of Asian Americans pursuing music
Mm-hmm.
as a major activity. In some ways, during the earlier period, the period I was born into, that was seen not as, it wasn't as much a priority of the survival,
Mm-hmm.
but more and more people are just understanding that actually it's a viable way to go. And folks have a lot more tools, because of technology. Technology, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
is another big, huge difference that changed in the course of my life. So we wouldn't be able to communicate worldwide and in meaningful ways in the moment.
And you have been instrumental in providing a voice for Asian American artists. Your Asian Improv Arts organization and the community work that you've done and provided, in addition to your own music, you've provided so many opportunities.
The whole point of when John Jang and I founded Asian Improv Records back in 1987, almost 40 years ago, our presence as leaders in making music and making art, there just weren't very many of us. And
Mm-hmm.
even the notion of what is Asian American identity and that we have a struggle for freedom and democracy, that was relatively new because the term Asian American actually was a term that came about in my lifetime.
Uh-huh.
Back in 1968, that's when people said, well, we're not going to allow the society to call us Oriental anymore. We're Asian. Well,
Mm-hmm.
we chose to self-define and not be kind of lumped together. And we chose to resist the kind of what we call othering. Like, we don't want to just be called the other people, the Orientals.
Right.
We wanted to assert our own definition. And so that's what people came up with. This is we want to be called Asian. And, I mean, the term Asian American is a little, there are some different kinds of pitfalls. I won't get into that right now, but at least the idea of Asian, that's actually grown quite a bit, not only here in America, but also in Asia. There is a sense of that we don't want to be called the Orient. We don't want to be seen as the other part of the world, like the whole idea of the West and the rest. We don't want to be the rest,
Right.
and so with that, then there was a certain amount of creative energy that was generated from this idea of assert who we are as complex people, that just because we want to be called Asian doesn't mean that our traditional culture is all that who we are. We're making and remaking ourselves and our culture in every moment, and every one of us is part of that process. So then, that's a way to battle the stereotypes, whatever it is, the rickshaw or the coolie hats or the slanted eyes, Fu Manchu mustache, all that kind
Hmm.
of stuff. Yeah. And so music became
Yeah.
a vehicle to basically say who we really are. A lot of times in my classes, I teach a song by Chris Ijima and Nobuko Miyamoto. It's called Something About Me is Today. And one of the lines in this is that in the song, and this was a song that they wrote back, I think in 71 or something like
Hmm.
that. There was a record called A Grain of Sand, and it was the line is who we really are, being able to see who I looked in the mirror and I saw me, and as opposed to our ideas about ourselves being kind of bestowed on us by the society, and that we are the ones who are able to state who we are. And there's no better way to do that than making our own music and making the
Yes.
music in the way that we want to make it, not in the way that we're expected to make it.
And you are a testimony to that.
I remember one of my colleagues, John Carlos Perea, he's American Indian and mixed and Irish German, and he's a musicologist and bass player and composer. He talked about in his dissertation, he talked about my music, and he said Francis sounds like himself, but that self is complex. And so then there's a journey that's one goes on to, I guess, explore that complexity, because a lot of times people think that to be Asian is to sound Asian. It's just, a lot of times it's those stereotypes
Yes.
about reducing us to, yeah, caricatures, basically. Yeah. And
Hmm.
so music in all its sophistication and possibilities of nuance really is a viable strategy to really make a statement. Like, we're complicated human beings, but we do have a past, we have a history, and we
Right.
have a legacy that continues to evolve. And I mean, for myself, improvisation is one of my key strategies. We are changing at this very moment, creating musical forms that allow for moment to moment expression has been important to my career. I really owe the African American tradition of jazz improvisation to be able to explore who I am.
Hmm. Can you tell us a few of your main influences?
I started hearing the music actually earlier on. Well, basically, when I was in like eighth, ninth grade, I got introduced by my music teacher to the music of Charlie Parker
Hmm.
and the music of Coleman Hawkins.
Hmm.
Um, because ironically, in my school or my school district, they discontinued orchestra. So I no longer could play the violin in school. And the teacher said, here are some wind instruments. And he gave me a saxophone. And so I was studying the saxophone, and he was visionary enough and open enough, said, like, well, if you want to hear how the saxophone can be played, check out Coleman Hawkins, check out this record by Charlie Parker. And I'm just going, well, what's that? And he says, well, what they're improvising. They're playing the own songs and they improvise. So they're developing the music in every moment. And so those musicians, that music really kind of resonated with me.
Hmm.
And later on, I was just really forced to interact with Max Roach, who happened to be the drummer on some of those Charlie Parker records.
Wow.
And my record label, Asian Improv, we were able to sign Max to, I think it's his second to last recording in his career. He made called Beijing Trio with John Jang and Jebing Chen. When he came to play in San Francisco, he had heard me and he wanted to play a duet with me in the concert. And so then I got a chance to play with him. And it was kind of an interesting experience because normally at that time we knew him to really want to do free improvisation. He said he didn't really want to go back. He didn't want to play the old tunes. But when we got when, you know, I was shaking in my boots, you know, and he said,
I feel it right now.
because
I
he said,
actually could
he
feel
pointed
it.
at me, he says, I want to play a duet with him. And I says, well, what are we going to do? And he hummed like one bar of Billy's Bounce and then counted it in. And so it's a good thing I knew that song. So we were able to kind of take off and play. Then someone said to me, you know, Francis, the names of these songs came after they were recorded. Go by the name of the songs, they just hum a few bars and then you're supposed to know it.
Uh-huh.
And that was quite an honor. And then also there was 800 people in the audience, right? So, you know, it's just like potentially, well, yeah, it's kind of nerve-wracking, but you know, it's just something has to kick in as a musician in this music. Something has to kick in that you're not paying attention to those 800 people in the audience. You're just paying attention to Max, one person, you know.
Yes.
And so you just go and do it.
Yeah.
Well, if you can, you just do it.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of one of my experiences, you know.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So that sounds like an incredible breakthrough experience playing with Max Roach that moment. And in addition to that, improvisation and free improvisation, this is what the tradition is in jazz. I'm not a jazz artist, but a lot of the works that you do and that you like the first time I heard you was actually when you were improvising to dancer Lenore Lee,
Yes.
improvising to her movement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that gave me a lot of insight into what is possible with music. And some of those unique projects that you have and that you've done, and you also compose music written like in a traditional manner, combining a lot of Eastern tradition with Western tradition and weaving them in and out without having stereotypes locking you in, like almost blowing the stereotype out of the water. So I'd love to hear about some of the unique projects that you've done that focus on, and it sounds like almost every project you do focuses on either activism or community building. And what is the difference between the two? Is there?
Well, I think the idea in community building is figuring out how to play music and reaching common ground with your participants, I guess is more a better way to call it. And so one of the projects that I did, it's called Shanghai Stories, and I was commissioned to work with this group called Melody of China, which is a traditional Chinese instrument group. They play traditional Chinese music, but they also play the music of today. So I wrote this piece that commemorates and celebrates my parents' experiences. My father was born in Shanghai, and it's complicated, but they ended up meeting in Shanghai and leaving Shanghai on the eve of the Civil War and went to Hong Kong. When I was working with Melody of China, I had already studied some Chinese music with Jiebing Chen. And so I had learned how to read and actually play some of the literature, not very well, but I learned it. So I wrote this piece, and the idea was to work with elements as a basis for improvisation. Some of the methodology is the idea of theme and variation. The variation could be much more than is typically thought of in a kind of, say, common practice classical method. So what I did in making this music was to encourage the members of the Chinese music ensemble to improvise, as well as the members of the jazz ensemble that I was together to work together. We had trombone, Wayne Wallace, we had Dazan Claiborne, you know, had Tatsuo Aoki in the band.
Hmm.
And so the idea was that we would improvise together based on these themes. And also the idea of the story, because part of the story has to do with Shanghai as a crossroads. You know, it's a crossroads not only in the world geographically, it's a crossroads of history,
Hmm.
because it was very important place in terms of its history, and it continues to be. So we created community in the ensemble by improvising together, also by playing these melodies that I wrote, but in writing melodies based on my reading and experiences with both Chinese music and jazz music. Not only we built community on stage, but then we had audiences who relate. So they
Right.
understand that we're improvising using Chinese source material, but we're also playing blues source material. So then there's a coming together.
Crossroads.
Yeah, kind of,
It's
yeah, just like,
just like
okay.
Shanghai. It's a
Yeah,
crossroads.
so the music itself, John Carlos Perea, he talks about how a song can be a site, that a song is a site for stuff to happen. A very clear example is how a song that draws on multiple traditions can be a site for community building. That's the nature of intersection,
Mhm.
of exploring the intersections. Audiences, for my music in general, the effort is to create a space of intersection, a space of communication, a space of awareness and understanding, a space for compassion. And
Yes.
so that was an example. It's up on YouTube.
We'll definitely have to share that in the show.
Part of the process, you know, it's like when I remember when they were commissioning to me, and I says, well, of course, as a composer, you always want to know, well, when, and you know, as a performer, you say, oh, when can I get the music? You know.
Hmm.
And so I asked him, what's the deadline? And he says, well, if you write it in Western notation, we have to translate it. So that means you have to give us some time because it's not so simple. But if you write it in Chinese notation, we can play it just like that and just bring it to rehearsal. I said, okay, I'll write in Chinese cipher notation, which I had learned because I had studied the erhu. That was kind of the process. So I wrote the piece in both Western, you know, the staff for the trombone, and then I wrote in Chinese cipher notation.
So the
Same
West,
piece, but written in two different notational systems.
so the Western instruments, like the trombone, they were using the Western notation, and then the Chinese instruments were using, but they were coming together.
Yeah, it
They
was the
were
same
reading
piece,
same piece. It's
but
just
different.
notation.
Yeah, different. But also, you know, I mean, I always remember I studied Gagaku music, which is the imperial court music of Japan.
Hmm.
And the master, this guy Togi, he basically talked about the text as a memo. The music is a text, but it's a memo, right? In the sense that it's just the basis on which you make your performance. So within jazz, the stuff isn't written down, but there are certain things written down as a guide or in some ways you can think of it as a memorandum or a map. It wasn't exactly Western, wasn't like Western classical notation that I use for tatsu and whatever. It was more of a map that we use in jazz and creative music.
Hmm.
So then that's another kind of elevation of the nuance in terms of the methodology. You know, so it's not like, okay, so then I wrote in notated European classical notation the same things that was written for the Chinese musicians, right?
Hmm.
So it's not like that, you know,
Right.
it's really something that folks who are coming from the jazz discipline can make their music, and then it's something that the musicians from the Chinese tradition. But see, the key part is these are methods to get off the page. So because the most important thing in our performances, and at least in some of my music, is to get off the page. Whether it's written down, whether everything's written down or not, it's still an issue of getting off the page because, we just did a recording of my violin works. And then
Right.
you kind of went through the experience, if you just went on the page, that wasn't exactly it, right? I mean, you had to get off the page and into your body and into your kind of, you're making the music, not
I
the page, right?
yes,
So,
and I think that's what a lot of musicians, students of music have to discover, because the music is really, it is off the page. The music is inside of you, and that's what you're so great at, Francis. And you enabled me to discover it more so, especially even in my classical music interpretation. Think Thinking of getting off the page of that, written out even in Bach and Mozart and Haydn and all of that, helps eliminate the stereotype, going right back to stereotypes of people. Uh, I think of us stereotyping people, and that gives us almost an upper hand of superiority, that, oh, well, we know more. The page of music, if that is the end all and you say, oh, well, that's how it has to be, that page of music has the upper hand. And then
right,
once again, you're not within yourself.
for sure,
Yeah.
for sure.
So,
So,
and I also want to bring up what you've done for kids
mm,
too, like young kids, how you've gone into community centers here in Lancaster. I've had you here, and you've
mhm.
gone into community centers, into, I think, even elementary schools, middle
Oh yeah,
schools, high schools. And you brought those kids together, and there was no music, written out music, let's say.
yeah, sure, sure.
And you had, I think, at one point you had about 70 kids in the classroom at the high school, creating and loving what they were doing, not beating themselves up because they missed a note.
Mm.
What is that all about?
When we make music together, just like when we make community, we do not, it's a lot more difficult to like mediate music making through the page,
Mm.
you know, because in order to make music in the moment with each other, just like making community, we need to get off the script
Mm.
because scripts can be, well, they're meant in some ways to limit your range of expression. And I mean, there's a purpose to it. And, I write scripts.
There's a big difference between a memo and a script.
So it's just kind of how you use the guide. I found in order to make music right away, we need to actually draw from people's actual experiences.
Mm.
And so what I mainly do, let's say actually, I remember that day at the high school. I don't know. It seemed like 100 people in this thing, and
There were a
we had
lot of people.
tubas and violins and saxophone. And so, it would just take a lot of work to actually write a music for that. But if we kind of rely on the people to write their own music, to write your own part, but based on some guidelines, which is some of the same rules that we as composers and musicians use, like, oh, okay, so we're in the 1-4-5 world, sometimes they call that.
Right.
So we kind of give some guidelines about pitch to use, rhythmic feel, and then rely on people to explore the sound that can be created and rely on people's natural inclination to make music by giving people the tools and in real time going for it. But also
Mm.
the fact that, like, in the piece that I did with that group was like it's somewhat Chinese music, but also somewhat the blues. And so there's a certain aesthetic that is immediately apparent.
Mhm.
And so when people start to play together, they could start to make those references. And then you're kind of relying on people's own devices to make music.
But it's difficult though. I mean, you say, well, this is easy, but there's so much conditioning about, oh, well, we have to have music in front of us. well, we have to have a conductor in front of us. We have to be told exactly what to do. And that's how they've been trained for so long. And yeah, it's going to feel good, but you're going to feel really awkward doing it. Uh, and it might take a little while to get to that point, though, because there's a lot of conditioning of how music is learned and how we have to manage time. Um,
Well,
What's your
sometimes
advice for that?
well, I think part of it is understanding that creativity is awkward. I mean, there's a phase. So it's understanding things, things change, happens in phases. And part of that part of the process is awkwardness.
Mm,
And I think in a lot of ways, we don't want to accept that awkwardness. We want things to be instantly productive. And,
right.
sometimes most of the time might be awkward until that very moment, then things click.
Yes. Got it.
In fact, that's a lot of what different people kind of talk about. Like, as a teacher, you have a student,
Mhm.
they don't sound good at the very beginning. I mean, I studied the violin. I remember like sounding terrible for quite some time. I was having fun, but it was kind of, it didn't sound like music. And then at a certain point, oh, I got a nice sound. And
Yes.
then things kind of opened up. And so I think but sometimes in an institutional setting, we want results because everything is results driven.
Yes.
They say evidence based. So they have this kind of terminology that sometimes makes us feel like, oh, so I need to generate the evidence. Well, actually takes a lot of resources to actually create that evidence. So yeah, but it's more important when you're creating community to actually have the feeling is there. And so then in order to create that feeling, we need to describe the notation system as like a fence. And maybe we need to take that fence away so that we can actually talk to each other.
Yes.
But we have to acknowledge that something new is going to be awkward. And so we have to adjust our expectation that things have to happen right away. Because the joy of creativity is to be awkward for a while and then all of a sudden, oh, something happened.
Hmm. Well, you probably answered the question that I was thinking, like, what advice would you give to younger generations now doing this work, whether it be, creative work, music, and going into community building? But it just like the awkwardness, just going
Well, I
through
think I
that
think I
sounds like
think
something.
well, I think one of the problems though in the society is we don't allow people to be awkward
Hmm.
because we have a lack of compassion for people in general.
Mm.
And so we have to be less judgmental. We have to have because we need to allow things to be where they're at so that we can move with it. But if you are ashamed of who you are, you're ashamed of your sound, that's just not going to, that's not the driver. In some ways, it's like sometimes there's like you could say, oh, I sound terrible. And just kind of beating yourself up. I sound terrible. And then somehow that's going to make you sound better, as opposed to like, oh, that's where it's at. What is, because I don't think I don't know, when I teach people, I don't say, oh, you sound terrible.
Right.
You know, well, it's more about, well, there's certain things about your sound that work or working, and then some of them are not working, something like that.
I think I need to take a cue from you once in a while, Francis.
Well, there's different strategies.
I admire what you do and how you do it, and I'm constantly learning, and I'm certainly learning from this conversation.
Well, I like, sometimes I think it takes a certain amount of courage to sound terrible
Yes.
because you have to be willing to share that's you're at your most vulnerable. So when a student comes to you, this is stuff I haven't done this well through my whole life. I had to learn these lessons
Right.
that we don't always honor the fact that how much anxiety and insecurity that our students have to go through in order to share their sound with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we kind of say, oh, that sucks, that's not really going to incur any, and maybe for some people it might. But
In a way, we can take on the flip side by saying, if they can accept that, oh, that sucks and that's not a bad thing.
well, that's true. That's true.
That's it. I mean, I think we're so caught up with being offended by, I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but I just think that I think the idea of telling younger generations, my advice, the advice from Francis Wong is sound terrible. And
Well, it's okay.
It's okay. And I think that,
well, that's why I use the term awkward,
awkward.
Use some other kinds of language that's not so, in some ways, demeaning and judgmental.
It's okay. So
right, because it's not the feeling of shame actually comes from the society. It doesn't come from us. That you should be ashamed, you should be better. No, that's really not, all that positive or all that constructive,
Yes. Well, I want to share how wonderful it was being out there in February, performing with you, and also doing the solo violin works that you wrote, and how you helped enlighten me to listen and be in the moment with those pieces, because it's very easy to just take the script and read it rather than be who you are. And you enabled me to do that in that moment. So that I will be putting a plug for your upcoming works to be released. Asian American Studies 101 for violin.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for playing this music and actually realizing that music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it's only potential when it's written on the page, So.
Yes.
I have utmost respect for your musicality and skill and vision for the violin. And you have the skills and training, experience, and drive to realize what you can hear. And so that's just amazing.
Well, the other thing is that I haven't realized what I hear yet. I'm still trying.
Oh, sure.
We do. And that seems to be the thing that most musicians, they're constantly, I mean, what we hear and what we play sometimes are what we want to have happen are two different things. So, well,
yeah, well, I think that's part of the process is, well, I think that's a whole nother kind of place to be. It's just the idea of, well, sometimes people, if they use this term, radical self-acceptance, in a sense that in any particular moment, I'm doing this. And then I can evaluate it afterwards, right?
yes,
That can't get in the way of actually doing it the way I can at this particular moment,
That is great. Radical self-acceptance at that moment. That is what you're doing, and accepting it.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Well, I think that we all kind of, I mean, I think you're able to do that on the violin. Is you've gotten to the place where, it's out. Well, Eric Dolphy, he had another way of saying it. He said, music once out in the air, you can never capture it again. So, what I'm saying, it's the music that if you feel like you can play better, it's just that's just a different moment. And you have a different opportunity to do what you want to do, so. But once it's done, you have to love it.
That's right. You have to love it. I think that's a great way to close out our show.
Well, wonderful.
You have to love it.
That went so fast.
It did. I cannot thank you enough for being here and sharing all your experiences and wisdom. Your attitude is wonderful to have, and the world is certainly a better place because of musicians and creatives like you.
We make the better world, you know.
Yeah.
We work on the world together.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank
Uh,
you.